of why I wrote this book. I teach in a philosophy department in Canada made up of myself and 4 very outspoken atheists. And as a result of that, I get a lot of students in my office asking some very provocative questions. But the questions are always, well, not always, but the questions are very often asked in a kind of a haphazard way. You know, well, what do you think about this? Well, what about the Euthyphro dilemma? And what about the problem of evil? And what about this? And what about that? And I just felt as though, rather than, answer all of these questions and objections in rapid fire succession in the way that they were asked, that I would actually just be able to hand them something and say, well, read this. Read this, or read chapter 5 of this, and then we can come back and talk about it. So I just published this little book with a small Canadian publisher. It's called Justin Press. I think my book was the 50th book that they had ever published in their whole history. But unfortunately, the publisher decided to use the British spelling of skeptic with a C instead of a K. So it looks like, to an American audience, engaging the septic. But I promise you, it's not a plumbing manual. It is actually a book of philosophy. So if anybody is interested in buying it, it's sold at, you can order it from Justin Press. I think it's the only place you can get it now. But anyway, that's all I'll say about that for now. So anyway, my topic tonight is Aquinas' cosmological argument for the existence of God. Thomas Aquinas' cosmological argument for the existence of God. And those of you who have studied philosophy might know that that really leaves some questions unanswered, because Aquinas has 5 arguments for the existence of God, the first 3 of which could be broadly construed as cosmological arguments. There's an argument, what he calls from motion, that's the first argument. The argument from causality, or efficient causality, is the second argument. It's the third argument that I'm going to talk about or really focus in on tonight. And it's the argument that Thomas Aquinas calls the argument from possibility and necessity. Okay? It is, in a way, one of the hardest arguments to follow and understand, but I think once you do follow and understand it, it is actually the most convincing of the 5 arguments, and I think the best way to confront so many atheists that we come into contact with in today's modern world. Okay, so that's what I'm going to focus in on tonight, the argument from possibility and necessity, and if I have time, I'd like to entertain as many objections to this argument as I have time for. These objections will range from the silly objections that can be dismissed very quickly to more sophisticated objections. So I'll try to give you a little bit of both, and maybe some in between. Okay, so what is the argument from possibility and necessity? Well, philosophers more recently have talked about these ideas of possibility and necessity with slightly different language. The word necessity has remained, but instead of the word possibility, if you really look and analyze what Thomas Aquinas means by that, he means something much more like what we would call contingency. Contingency. And so to understand this argument well, we have to understand the difference just between these ideas of contingency or possibility on the one hand, and necessity on the other. And I think the best way to at least begin understanding these concepts is to understand them in terms of what we might call contingent versus necessary facts, or contingent versus necessary truths. Okay? Contingent versus necessary truths. And what does it mean for a truth to be contingent? Well, really all it means is that it is a truth that is true, but it doesn't have to be true. Or it is a truth that is true that could be false if things were otherwise. Okay? So the fact that the walls in this room are a kind of maroon color, right? That is a contingent truth. They happen to be maroon or purple or whatever you want to call that, but they're not. That's the color they are. But they don't have to be that color. They could be some other color. My height, I'm 6'4". That is a contingent truth. The fact that I am 6'4" is a contingent truth. Okay? There is a television screen in this room. That would be another example of a contingent truth. It is true, but it doesn't have to be true. Okay? Necessary truths are very different. A necessary truth is something that does have to be true, that simply cannot be false, either in this state of affairs or in any other state of affairs. Okay, so oftentimes philosophers, particularly philosophers of mathematics and analytic philosophers, will use mathematical statements as examples of necessary truths. 2 + 2 = 4. Okay? 2 + 2 = 4, that just has to be. That 2 + 2 cannot be anything other than 4. Okay? One of Aquinas' favorite examples is a whole is always greater than any of its parts. A whole is always greater than that's true by definition. That has to be true. If you know what a whole is, and you know what a part is, and you know what the word greater means, you'll see that that just has to be true everywhere and always. Another example would be, some other geometrical truth. The degrees of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. That has to be true. That is true by definition. That's part of the very essence or the nature of a triangle. Okay, so that's essentially the difference between necessary truths and contingent truths. Now, mind you, necessary truths aren't any more true than contingent truths. They're not truer. They're just true in a different way. Perhaps a kind of a stronger sense, but they're not more true, they're just true in a different way. Now, one of the things that Aquinas would say, and many other philosophers would say, is that if you really analyze the difference between necessity on the one hand, or necessary truths on the other, and contingent truths, one thing that you'll notice is that it seems to belong to the very nature of a contingent truth to have an explanation. If something is the way it is, but doesn't have to be the way it is, there's always some reason as to why it is the way it is. Right? So I just think of the examples that I gave you tonight about the contingent truths. The color of the walls in this room. The walls in this room are maroon. Okay? There's an explanation for why they're maroon. It's probably not a very exciting explanation. There was probably some, the thirsty dog, CEO, sat down with his advisors and said, what should we paint that room? And somebody said, I have a couple extra gallons of that maroon paint. Boom, there's your explanation, okay? The height that I have grown to in my adulthood, 6'4". There's an explanation for that. The fact that, I have the parents that I have. There's a genetic explanation. My diet might explain to a certain degree why I've grown to this height. The fact that I live on the planet Earth, as opposed to some other planet, would explain why I'm 6'4" and not some other height. The fact that there's a television in this room, again, it has an explanation. Again, it's probably not a very exciting explanation, but there is a reason why there's a television in this room. We all know that, and the reason we all know that instinctively is because we know that there doesn't have to be a television in this room. The walls in this room don't have to be the color that they are. I don't have to be the height that I am, but I am that height. And so there must be a reason as to why I am that height. Necessary truths, by contrast, do not have that same kind of explanation. There's a kind of analytical explanation as to how 2 + 2 = 4. But there is no explanation as to how 2 + 2 came to equal 4, in the same way that there's an explanation as to how these walls came to be the color that they are. There's no, 2 + 2 never came to equal 4, it just does. Right? Triangles never came to have 180 degrees, they just do. Wholes never came to be greater than any of their parts, they just are. That's just what a whole is. So that essentially is, again, one of the essential differences between contingency and necessity. Contingency by nature, by the very essence of what it is must have some explanation. Necessity doesn't. And we, you might say we instinctively know that. Even if we come across a fact or a truth or an observation that we have no idea what the explanation is, we all know that there is one. Okay? If you walk out the door and you see a giant glowing sphere, you'll say, somebody, well, how did that get there? And like, well, maybe this happened, well, maybe that happened. Even if all of the explanations that people give are completely implausible, it would be even more implausible to say that, well, there just is no explanation. it's just there. No. It can't have no explanation whatsoever. And why? Because it doesn't have to be there, but it is there, so we know there must be a reason as to why it's there. I don't mean reason in terms of purpose. I just mean reason in terms of an explanation as to how it got there. Okay? So that is the essential sort of conceptual distinction that's at work here. Now, just as Aquinas would argue, just as it makes sense to speak of the difference between contingent and necessary truths, it also makes sense to speak of the difference between contingent and necessary beings. Contingent and necessary beings, or things. Now, this distinction doesn't jump right out at us because everything that we have any kind of immediate experience of is a contingent thing. So what is a contingent thing? Well, a contingent truth is just a truth that doesn't have to be true, but is. What is a contingent being? A being that exists, but doesn't have to exist. A being that exists, but does not exist of necessity. It doesn't have to exist. And so we can apply the same insight about contingent truths, that they must have an explanation, to contingent things. And indeed, our almost universal experience, not almost, our universal experience confirms this. A thing which doesn't have to exist, but does exist, always has some explanation as to why it exists, or how it came to exist. This is essentially the nature of a contingent thing, or a contingent being. Now, as Aquinas says, and this in a way harkens back a little bit to his second argument for the existence of God, anything that has an explanation for its existence has that explanation from something else. So a contingent thing exists because it came into existence or was caused to exist by something other than itself. And again, to pick any example you want, you'll find some explanation waiting in the wings. This building exists from some other thing that caused it to exist, some construction crew that built it up. A tree outside exists because some other tree dropped a seed and planted in the ground and it grew up to be a tree. All of you exist because of your parents in some way or another. So this is again, just part of the notion, or part of the very nature of what it means to be a contingent thing. Now, what Aquinas would argue is that the world in which we find ourselves, what he calls the world of sense, but really all that means is the world that appeals to our senses, the world that we can see and feel and touch. And that goes a long way. The world even that we can see not just with our eyes, but with the most powerful microscope, also with the most powerful telescope. That world is a material world, a physical world, and by virtue of that very fact, it is a contingent world. It does not have to exist, but it does exist. And so there must be some explanation as to why it exists. There must be some explanation as to why it exists. For no other reason than that, it is a contingent thing. It does not logically, it does not exist of logical necessity. So if, as the great Thomistic commentator Father Frederick Copleston said, there is no material world other than the sum total of material things in the world. And so that sum total of material things in the world as contingent things means that the world, that the material physical world itself, the universe as if you might want to call it that, must itself have an explanation. The world does not have to exist, but it does exist, and therefore it cries out for an explanation as to why it exists. Now that explanation might be some other contingent thing. It might be some other, use your imagination, some other thing that is responsible for the existence of the world or the things in the world, which is itself contingent. But then that too would require some explanation as to why it exists, as opposed to non-exists. And if that explanation was also a contingent thing, then it would need an explanation, and then it would need an explanation. Ultimately, the only way to provide the explanation that the contingent world requires is to finally admit the existence of a thing whose existence is not contingent, but which is rather necessary. The only way to account for the universe of contingently existing things is to admit the existence of a being whose existence is necessary. Now, this necessary being, granted, if you really think through what that would mean, it would be unlike anything that you have direct experience of. This thing would be a thing for which it would be true to say it exists as necessarily as it is necessary that 2 + 2 = 4. And this being, this necessary being, Thomas Aquinas finally concludes, is what we call God. This necessary being is what we call God. Okay? So that is essentially a very distilled version of Aquinas' third argument for the existence of God. Now, what makes this claim at the end so striking is that the being that Thomas Aquinas concludes with, necessary being, in addition to having the property of being necessary, also, because it cannot be a material thing, because all material things, by definition, are contingent. All material things can be other than they are. All material things can not be. This necessary being must also be immaterial. Because it exists of necessity, it can't come into existence or go out of existence. So it must also be eternal. So it must be necessary, it must be immaterial, it must be eternal, and if you follow the argument, it must also in some way be a being whose existence is responsible for the existence of everything else. So it must in some sense be creative in some way. Just in that limited respect, because its existence would be necessary for the existence of everything else, the contingent world that we see and live in. So this is not a complete description of the biblical God, but it certainly goes a long way to getting us there. And of course, when Aquinas says, and this being everybody understands to be God, he doesn't mean that he just proved the existence of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But what he means is that those people who already believe in the existence of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will recognize this thing as the same thing that they believe in. Right? So that is essentially the argument. Now, before I take your questions, and I do want to take your questions, I just want to consider a couple objections, and let me just make sure that I'm not going too far over the time limit here. There's a couple of objections that always come against this argument, and I hear them all the time because, of course, I teach philosophy to undergraduate students, and I hear the objections every time I teach this argument. And the first objection, it comes as predictably and as commonly as anything else. Somebody will always raise their hand and say, okay, but who created God? Who created God? And of course I have to bite my tongue a little bit, because if they're asking that, they didn't quite get the argument. They didn't quite understand it. Because of course, if you're asking who created God, you haven't really comprehended what it means for a thing to be a necessary being. For a thing to be a necessary being is to not have been created at all, either by something else or even by oneself. Really what people mean when they ask, but who created God? What they're actually doing is they're going back and they're restating the argument in their own minds with the premise something like everything has to have a cause. Everything has a cause, so we have to have a first cause, and the first cause we call God. But no version of this cosmological argument or any other cosmological argument ever given by a philosopher has ever included the premise everything has to have a cause. That is nowhere in the argument at all. All we said was that contingent things must have an explanation for their existence. So, and this unfortunately is an error committed by not just undergraduate students, but even those who teach philosophy at very prestigious universities. Daniel Dennett, for example, in his book about atheism, makes this very, very basic fundamental error. He attributes the premise, everything has to have a cause, to the cosmological arguments for the existence of God, and it's just a huge mistake. So anyway, that is one thing that to be on the lookout for. What else? What other objections come against this objection? Okay, oftentimes somebody will say, well, we don't need God because maybe the universe just always was. Maybe the universe just always existed, so we don't need a first cause or a necessary being. And in that sense, again, that in a way is to misunderstand the argument, because interestingly, Aquinas' argument for the existence of God it's completely indifferent. It's completely indifferent to the question of whether the world or the universe actually had a temporal beginning sometime in the finite past. For Aquinas, the world very well may have no beginning at all. I mean, he believes on faith that it does, but philosophically it can't be proven, he argues, that the world had a beginning point in time. Consider an analogy. Imagine that you're standing over a train track with a friend of yours, and you're seeing a train disappear behind a hill or a mountain. And you say to your friend, okay, let's see the last car of the train. What's moving that train, or what's causing that car to move? And they would say, well, it's the car in front of it that's pulling it. And they say, okay, but what's causing that one to move? And you say, well, it's the car in front of that. Well, okay, what's causing that one to move? What's the car in front of that? And finally they get frustrated and say, okay, but what's causing the whole train to move? And you say, well, what do you mean? It's just an infinite series of cars. Well, maybe, but even if there is an infinite series of cars, to speak analogously, that doesn't explain the motion of the train. Just that there's a lot of cars doesn't explain why the train is actually moving. The only way to explain why the train is actually moving is to admit the existence of at least one car that is moving itself and everything else, but which is not itself being moved. And this is, again, the role that is played by the necessary being. So to say, well, maybe the universe just always existed, doesn't get you out of the problem of having to provide an explanation if that universe is still just a universe of contingent things. If that's all it is, even if it doesn't have a beginning, it still needs an explanation as to why it exists as opposed to not exist. Some people argue that the notion of a necessary being is self-contradictory. I had a debate about the cosmological argument some years ago with a colleague, one of these atheist colleagues of mine on campus, and this was one of his arguments. That the notion of a necessary being is self-contradictory, kind of like a square circle. And I just challenged him to defend that, and of course he couldn't. Why? Where's the contradiction? Where's the contradiction there? There is no contradiction. A necessary being, if you acknowledge the possibility of a necessary truth, a necessary being is just a being. When you say it exists, you're speaking a necessary truth. So there is no logical contradiction in the idea or the concept of a necessary being. But some people will say, well, but I just can't imagine what a necessary being would be like. It doesn't make any sense to me. And I would say, well, I can't either. I can't imagine it either. I can't imagine God. God does not appeal to my imagination when I think about God in the abstract that way. But just because you can't imagine something doesn't mean that it's an incoherent idea. René Descartes, the famous French philosopher, who wasn't too big on the cosmological argument, but he said, he used the example of a chiliagon, a geometrical figure with 1,000 sides. 1,000 sides. Nobody in this room can imagine a chiliagon with all of the sides, right? But the concept is crystal clear. Crystal clear. 1,000-sided object. 1,000-sided polygon, to be more precise. So, again, just because you can't imagine it doesn't really demonstrate anything. I'm going to skip over some of these because I want to get to your questions and discussion. One of the arguments that, and I think this is kind of an interesting one, one of the arguments or the objections against the cosmological argument that I often hear is what I call the prior experience objection. The prior experience objection. And it basically says this. Imagine that you're lying in bed one night and you hear a kind of a rustling noise above you in the attic. And you don't know what that rustling noise is. And you're lying there and you think, well, maybe it's a squirrel, or maybe it's a bat, or maybe it's some other kind of woodland creature that got in the house somehow. And then somebody said, well, maybe it's an elf or a gnome. And you say, well, what makes the squirrel explanation a better explanation than the elf or the gnome? Well, we have prior experience of squirrels and bats. We don't have any prior experience of elves and gnomes. So it would make more sense to attribute it to the squirrel. And for that reason, the argument goes, if you have no prior experience at all of something, that reduces its explanatory potential to zero. Right? If you have no prior experience at all, it reduces its explanatory power to zero. Now, that would be true even if the sound that you heard was more like the sound that an elf would make. If you heard not only like thumping around, but like some little giggling sound or something like that, that might be, it really sounded kind of like an elf, but no, I know there's no such thing as elves. I have no prior experience of elves, so I'm going to go with a squirrel, kind of maybe a weird squirrel, but I'm going to go with the squirrel explanation because I know that's what I have experience of. And they would say, well, it's equally invalid to appeal to God as an explanation for the existence of the contingent world because we have no prior experience of God, of a necessary being. Now, I think that's actually a pretty good objection, a pretty interesting objection. But the problem with it is that it's not as though in the cosmological argument we're preferring the explanation the necessary being explanation over some other explanation. The cosmological argument makes a very bold claim. The bold claim made by Aquinas is that, no, a necessary being it's not just the best explanation. It's not just the best explanation that is most fitting to the data we have in front of us. It truly is the only explanation. The only alternative to admitting the existence of a necessary being is just to say that there is no explanation at all. So the analogy fails. The analogy fails. It's not just that God is the best explanation for the existence of the contingent world. It's that he is the only explanation, if an explanation is indeed what you're looking for. Okay. I'll do two more. There's another objection that states, well, why then do we have to say, okay, I agree, okay, the contingent world doesn't explain itself, but why do we have to admit, or why do we have to come to the conclusion of just one necessary being? Why not many? Why can't there be many necessary beings that explain the existence of the external world? And that's an interesting objection. Now, I'm not going to go into this because it would take us way far afield. Aquinas actually does have a pretty lengthy argument as to once you begin to think through what this necessary being must be like, and the way in which the existence and the essence of that necessary being must ultimately be one and the same, you'll see at the end of this long argument that there really can only be one of those things. But really, that's in a way beside the point if you're dealing with an atheist. Because if you're dealing with an atheist, you might say, well, look, okay, fine. I'll just say that there must be at least one necessary being. And if you go by the principle of Occam's razor, that you eliminate all unnecessary causes, one necessary being is sufficient to explain the existence of the contingent world. And you'll say, well, by Occam's razor, then I'm just going to posit the existence of one necessary being. It doesn't defend necessarily the monotheistic worldview in all of its detail, but at least it's sufficient to refute atheism, right? So that would be another argument. Okay? And then finally, I had a few more, but I think I'd like to just talk about one more objection. Why? Okay, I see that there must be some sort of necessary being, and I see that this being must have certain properties, but why call this being God? Why call this being God? And in a way, all of Aquinas' arguments for God's existence end that way. He argues for the existence of a first mover, and this we all understand to be God. Argues for the existence of a first cause, and this we all understand to be God. Argues for the existence of some principle of the governance of the world, and this we all understand to be God, a designer, and so on. And that frustrates people sometimes. Well, it doesn't sound like God to me, But Aquinas would say, and this has been pointed out by many, many different Thomistic commentators, that it is truly remarkable when you think through the idea of a necessary being, a being that must exist by definition, a being whose very nature it is to be. It is an awful lot like the way in which God reveals himself on Mount Sinai. He tells Moses, I am who am. I am who am. I am the being who is. Now, you don't necessarily have to read that as a philosophical truth or the conveyance of a philosophical truth. But many philosophers had. Even if Moses didn't have the first clue as to what that meant, it doesn't mean that it doesn't in fact mean that. Scripture can have many meanings. Yeah. So that is one way in which the idea of a necessary being actually does cohere well with the biblical God that we all believe in, if we do believe in it. the famous atheist Richard Dawkins really tried to hammer the cosmological argument from this exact point of view. He said, okay, fine. Maybe there is some sort of necessary being out there in the ether, but in fact, so what? This doesn't sound anything like the God that Christians and Muslims and Jews believe in. It's just, it says nothing about God, the God who hears prayers and who reads our innermost thoughts and who is able to do miracles. And so, I'm going to stay an atheist. So to think about how ridiculous that is. Somebody who just got done demonstrating the existence of an immaterial, eternal, necessary, creative being. For Richard Dawkins to complain that it doesn't also show that God is omniscient and omnipotent and hears our prayers and reads our innermost thoughts. Okay, well, I'm sorry, it doesn't tell us what killed off the dinosaurs either, or where Jimmy Hoffa is buried. But it's still a pretty darn good argument. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Okay, I don't know if you want to come up and ask a question with the microphone, you can, but I think this room is small enough that you could just kind of shout it out, and I can probably hear you. So. Do you want me to call on people because they know people's names? If lots of hands go up, then I guess you could. But if not, then just take them as they come.
Well, any questions?
You really already answered this. I'm just looking for some language. So you hear, people talk about, one of the things is the Big Bang Theory.
Yeah.
And they said, well, maybe that's always the way it was. The universe expands and it contracts. Then it expands and then it contracts. Just give some language for...
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the cosmological argument for God's existence is really part of what I would call a kind of a family of arguments, okay? And one of the arguments that I did not talk about today is an argument that actually claims to be able to prove that the world must have had a beginning point in time, sometime in the finite past. There are philosophical arguments that claim to show that, and there are which Aquinas rejected, and but also made by some pretty smart people. St. Bonaventure being among them. And then there are also scientific arguments that claim to show that the world came into existence from a singularity about 13.5 billion years ago, right? And this is what we call the Big Bang. I think the great thing about Aquinas' argument, Aquinas' third way, and it has this in common with Leibniz's cosmological argument as well, is that it's completely indifferent to that. Whether the universe had a beginning point in time in the finite past, or whether we are in some sort of eternal oscillation of cosmic expansion and contraction, is completely beside the point, because as a contingent conglomerate of material things, it nonetheless requires an explanation. It nonetheless does that. So think of the train analogy again, that even if the train is infinitely long, that doesn't eliminate the need for something like a locomotive, right? So I would say those who point to the Big Bang and to say that no, the Big Bang wasn't necessarily the beginning of it all, still haven't addressed the crucial question that the cosmological argument both asks and I think answers. So I hope that helps. Yeah.
Where does the cosmological argument fall into the evolution theory? Or if you can comment on that, if you ever hear anything about that.
Okay. That really, I would say that's probably really a non sequitur in a way. I mean, because evolutionary theory whether evolutionary theory is completely true, just as Darwin said it was, or whether it is completely wrong, that we're completely misinterpreting the data. in both of those events, I think the cosmological argument would be equally strong. Equally strong. It is interesting. I mean, when someone asks about evolution and whether one believes in evolution, you really have to know what they mean by that before you address it. I mean, one meaning just is, do you believe that species evolve from certain species into other species? You know, and that, I think that is generally unproblematic. Some people mean, you know, something much more than that. Some people mean, are physical or material forces sufficient all by themselves to explain the complexity of life, you know, that we observe? That's a much more difficult claim. It's been far from proven that is the case. But whether it's the case or not, the cosmological argument is just as strong. That's why I like it so much, because it can look past all that stuff and still arrive at the existence of God, you know, as a necessary truth. Good question, though. Good question.
I have one.
Okay. Speak up. Yeah. Here.
I don't have to yell if I'm standing right next to you. So, in what way is the third way related to St. Anselm's ontological argument? Because they both sort of rely on sort of like logical necessity. Like when you're talking about necessary truths, you get the example of a triangle having 180-degree angles added up together. So, like, if you could answer that question, in what ways is it similar? And in what ways is it different?
Great question. Yeah. For those of you who don't know, St. Anselm, who lived, about 100 years before Aquinas, or 200 years, maybe, 200 years before Aquinas, had an argument that was very simple. It was kind of like an analytical argument for God's existence. It was essentially that, you know, if you could just imagine or conceptualize an infinitely perfect being, that being would have to have perfect goodness and perfect justice and supreme power and complete wisdom. And if you really think about the concept, that being would have to have all the perfections, or it wouldn't be a perfect being. It wouldn't be, as Anselm says, a being in which nothing greater can be conceived. You know, but it is a being than which nothing greater can be conceived, the being that you're thinking of. Therefore, it has to have all of the perfections, including justice and wisdom and power and existence. Because if it lacked existence, it would lack one of the things that go into making something supremely perfect, and it would no longer be supremely perfect. But since it is supremely perfect, you must admit, therefore, that this being than which nothing greater can be conceived exists, as well as is powerful and wise and so on. So essentially, we can debate the merits of the argument. Aquinas does not believe that the argument works. But essentially, you could characterize it this way, that according to Anselm, all you really need to do is reflect sufficiently on the idea of God, and you will ultimately see that there must be a God. Right? And it is true then that like Aquinas, St. Anselm believes that existence is part of the very definition of God. So Anselm also shares that with Aquinas. But although they agree that existence is part of the very definition of God, or of what God must be, Aquinas doesn't believe that you can get there just by analyzing the concept of God. Aquinas says very famously that we must reason to the existence of God in the reverse order of the order of nature. In the order of nature, we have cause leading to effect. We reason to the existence of God from effect to cause. We must start with the world that we can see and touch and feel. We must start, in other words, with the world of contingent things, of material, physical, contingent things. We must start with the world of creation, so to speak. and reason our way back to a creator. Once we reason our way back to a creator, we will see that that is a being such as the description that Aquinas gives. But we can't start with that idea. We can't reason to God's existence after the matter of a kind of mathematical proof, and that would be more akin to what Anselm says. So yeah, they wind up at the same place, but they get there very differently. Aquinas says, no, we must begin with creation and see that creation implies the existence of a creator. And we can do that in 5 different ways. Great question, though. Great question. Mr. Trapani.
Okay, so reflecting not only on the third argument, but also the way in which ultimately all 5 of them depend upon the being whose very nature is the act of existing itself. What Aquinas produces is a rational argument that receives from the one who reads the argument a rational assent. My question to you is, and in asking this question I want you to remove your scholar's hat and speak to a Theology on Tap group from your heart. Because the assent to a rational argument will never cause you to genuflect. It will never cause you to kneel, or in other language we might say, it will never bring, the assent to a rational argument will never bring about conversion of the heart. And so I wonder if you might comment on what you think might bring about conversion of the heart, and whether these rational arguments of Aquinas are of any use in that.
No, I appreciate that question, and I've had it asked before, and I wish I remembered what I said. But it was something to this effect. You're absolutely right that coming to see philosophically that there must be a necessary being, a being that sounds an awful lot like what we say when we say we believe in God, does not at all make what we call a sufficient condition for embracing that God, with the heart. But I'll say this just as in my experience teaching philosophy, which I know doesn't equal yours, but there are, and especially teaching philosophy in a secular school, which I can pull a little bit of rank there, right? and that's atheism is a real thing. Atheism is a real thing. And in my experience, there is a yearning to know God, to be loved by God, to embrace what God has to reveal. Sometimes the only thing that's still preventing that from happening is a kind of an intellectual problem, or at least a perception that intelligent people aren't believers. But then when you're confronted with an argument that those scales fall from your eyes, there is a receptivity. Not always, not necessarily. Some people will see that there must be a God, but I think what you're talking about is, the difference between seeing that there is a God and believing what God has revealed, right? Believing what God has revealed. And there is a narrow but bottomless gap between those two things. And the principal agent in getting us over that gap is not us. It's the Holy Spirit, according to according to the Christian faith and what I believe. So that is, there is a certain point at which God has to carry you over that. So that's about all I can think to say. But yeah, it's an excellent question. Excellent question. There must be more. There must be more. I should have talked a lot longer. Yes, in the back.
When you've spoken with people, especially like I've noticed with my peers, when you try to bring up like an ultimate cause or the first mover, they like to be all smart and be like, oh, but string theory, there's a billion different realities, there are infinite realities, so blah, 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 and they complicate it. What are some examples? Because like they're not following your trained like argument, like it's literally going right past them. Do you ever have any like concrete, like here and now, I'm just gonna talk to you like you're a kid on the street, here's an example where like you're asking them questions to get them to wake up to the train argument? Good luck. Like to cheer them up in the room to like I guess like have other people be like, oh my gosh, she's so right, I think that way every day, or I act this way every day.
Well, I don't think one necessarily has to do that. One of the great things about the cosmological argument for God's existence is that I really believe this. It really is completely immune to anyone who says that science has, but science has shown this or shown that. None of it matters. None of it really matters in the end. And a good example of that is not so much string theory, but well, there was a book written by a guy, an atheist named Lawrence Krauss. Some of you may have heard of him. I think he's actually here in Ohio. He teaches at Case Western, doesn't he, Lawrence Krauss?
No way.
I think he does, yeah. Anyway, he's a physicist. And he wrote a book defending atheism called Creation from Nothing, or a universe from nothing. A universe from nothing. And he claimed to show that quantum mechanics, if you analyze what he calls the quantum void, that a proton can just pop out of nowhere, right? In a way that is completely unpredictable and not at all subject to the laws of non-quantum physics, of Newtonian physics, but that this can happen. And so if this is possible, then maybe that's what the universe is. Maybe just somewhere at 13.5 billion years ago, a proton just popped into existence, and then another one did, and another one did, and then one thing led to another, and then we have this universe. There's a big problem with that, and actually you don't need to take my word for it. Physicist after physicist after physicist has shown how sophistical and really just completely invalid this argument is. What Krauss calls the quantum vacuum sounds to the untrained scientific ear like nothing. And the book is called A Universe from Nothing. Right? But the quantum vacuum is far from nothing. It is a brimming, buzzing sea of physical activity. And yes, maybe a proton will appear that you can't explain, why it did, but it did not come out of nothing. It came out of the quantum vacuum, which is full of material activity and existence. So, that's the problem with arguments like that. If you can just kind of cut through them a little bit, I think you can see just how vacuous they are at the end of the day. Pardon the pun.
I liked it.
Here's a good credit.
Anybody else? Really let me off the hook here.
I got a shit about everybody else.
I can like,
Yes.
it just reminds me of what you said, that quoting the Catechism, it talks about when original sin happened, trust in our Creator died in our hearts. And it seems like, because of our fallen nature, and thank God for Aquinas and giving all these thoughts, but I guess, you know, what it is really a work of grace to appreciate we're all here and that, you know, thanks be to God, we accept that, you know, that, because, you know, something in people's hearts have died because of original sin. And I think what you're trying to do through these rational arguments is to try to open the door for grace to take the facts and do the work, kind of like what you're saying. You know, take the logic and then take the leap of faith.
Yeah, you know, when you were just talking there, it reminded me, somewhere Aquinas says, and I cannot remember the reference here, somewhere he says that the greatness of a work can be judged by the difference between what you start with compared to what you finish with, right? And if that's true, then the work of creation is, from a certain perspective, the greatest work, because anything that comes from nothing is there's gonna be in a way a kind of an infinite gap between what you start with and what you finish with. Even if all God ever created was a tiny molecule, you know, it would still be a kind of an infinitely great achievement because it came from nothing at all, right? So, you know, what I like to try to remember is that, yes, you know, people's faith sometimes struggle, and it's sometimes people think, well, if I were just to see a miracle, you know, I would believe better. You know, if somehow, you know, somebody could just walk through that wall right there, or if somebody could, you know, be suspended in air, or if we could, you know, see someone cured of an incurable disease, that would be the miracle that I would need to see in order to believe. But in a very real sense, the fact that there exists anything at all is an infinitely greater miracle. The very mystery of existence itself, the fact that there is something as opposed to nothing, is a miracle that should strike us with far greater awe than if Audrey just walked through that wall, you know, which she might be getting ready to do right now. Yes.
I'm struggling to understand just what you have shown Aquinas proves, or even intends to prove. It seems to me that a corollary of a contingent being, that is a corollary of a being that is contingent, is that it is a part. It's something, not everything. Therefore, in need of something other than itself in order to be. But if that's true, then the whole of things would be in a different way from the way in which all of the things that are in that whole. And therefore, to jump already to the conclusion, it seems to me that Aquinas' argument might be taken as readily to be a demonstration of the existence of a whole that is in a mysterious way beyond what we understand as being. It seems to me as readily a proof of that as that it is a proof of a being that is itself beyond the whole.
Yeah, I mean, I think Aquinas' response to that would be even the sum total of all contingent things would still itself be contingent and require an explanation beyond itself. But the whole itself, I mean, is your question that the whole itself then should be understood as sort of greater than the sum total of its parts?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, this could be. It could be, yeah. Right, could be. And in a way, I mean, the challenge to the argument is in a way this, that does Aquinas in making this argument commit what logicians call the fallacy of composition? The fallacy of composition, which is, in other words, to assume that because all of the parts are a certain way, that the whole must necessarily be that way as well. And the fallacy of composition is a real fallacy. It is not necessarily valid to conclude that the whole is a certain way because all of the parts are that way. So for example, before I was married and I was a bachelor and I would cook, try to cook, I would say, well, this tastes good and this tastes good and this tastes good, but the finished product did not taste very good. Or an orchestra, John, you're a musician. You can gather a lot of talented musicians together, but that does not necessarily make a good orchestra. The whole is greater than the sum total of its parts. So you can't necessarily argue that a whole is a certain way because all of the parts are that way, but in some cases you can. In some cases you can. So this wall, you could say that this wall, does it follow that because all of these bricks are maroon, that the wall as a whole must be maroon? And I think you could say, yes, it does follow, because the wall is nothing other than the sum total of the blocks. But could you say that because all of these blocks are rectangular, the wall must necessarily be rectangular? No, that would not follow. The wall could be any number of shapes with a sum total of rectangular blocks. So really, to know whether the whole must take on the properties of the parts has to do with just the nature of the kind of thing that you're talking about. And I guess I would argue that the sum total of material things in the universe is, if they indeed are contingent, I think it just follows from that the universe as a whole must be contingent. It's much more like the wall than like the orchestra, it seems to me. I guess we could, if you think it might be more like the orchestra, then we might have a problem. But yeah, I think that's.
Could you locate that in its materiality?
No. There are. In fact, Aquinas says this quite. You could say anything that is material must be contingent, but not everything that is contingent is necessarily material. The angels, they're not material beings, but they're contingent. They're created, right? They're not necessary beings. So, that's all I can really think to say on that. But there's a lot more to think about. If anybody is interested in thinking even deeper still about that there is something called the Hume-Edwards objection to the cosmological argument, which goes even further down that road, but we can talk about that in the car on the way back. My dad, by the way. Troublemaker. Yeah. Go ahead.
So can a necessary being create another necessary being?
Good question. Yeah, just the argument that I gave tonight would indicate no, because a necessary being creating another necessary being, the being that was created couldn't by definition be necessary, because a necessary being is a being that by definition has to exist and therefore must be eternal. So it's not that the necessary being wouldn't be strong enough to do it. It's that the other necessary being, by definition, could not be the kind of thing that would be subject to being created at all. It must be an eternal being. And so it couldn't come into existence or go out of existence as a result. Yes, you and you.
Couldn't it, it's just to follow up on that, couldn't it be necessary by emanation though? Where okay, so you have a self-existent being, and that self-existent being must, for some reason, necessarily create this other being. Then that second being, although it's not self-existent, it would still be necessary in the sense that it must exist because this self-existent thing must create it.
Yeah, I think that if you can use the term necessary in that more limited sense, Aquinas actually does make that distinction right there in the third way, actually. He says, he makes the distinction between something that is necessary in just the way you described, and something that is, he calls absolutely necessary. Something that is absolutely necessary is something that exists in and of itself, is not subject to generation or corruption or coming into existence at all, and which exists in its own right. But yeah, something that exists by emanation, and it's, again, Aquinas isn't he believes that the world came into existence sometime in the finite past, but it's not necessarily so. So, a philosopher could say, well, maybe God was always creating something, from time eternal, and even if that were true, that thing would still be contingent in an important sense. So imagine a bowling ball resting on a pillow from all eternity, right? The bowling ball is the cause of the indentation on the pillow, even though they're both coextensive with one another, right? So yes, the distinction, I fully accept it.
Okay.
What you're suggesting.
I was just going to say that argument that a necessary being couldn't create another necessary being. Wouldn't you could say that that's a good argument for the Trinity? Because they have had to have always existed as one in order for Jesus to be fully God and fully man. He would have always had to have existed because if he is God, he is part of the thing that has always existed.
And we speak of the Trinity very much in that same language of emanation, right? That eternal emanation. So yeah, I again fully agree with that analogy. Great questions. Great questions. One more?
Okay.
One more.
This might be a quick answer, but I was wondering, and I'm asking primarily because I haven't read the opening questions of Prima Pars in a while, so it might be a quick yes or no, I just don't remember. But is Aquinas' proof for why there can be only one necessary cause, does it have anything to do with that necessary cause being infinite? If he can prove that a necessary cause must be infinite, there can only be one.
It has more to do with the unity of essence and existence.
Okay.
So what God ultimately is, as he puts it, esse per ipsum, existence itself. And so once you think that through, there can only be one thing that is existence itself. So that it's more that rather than the infinity property. Although of course ultimately in God all properties are the same. So it's you could see it from that way, from that perspective. But it's more the unity of essence and existence. Great. Yes.
Do other religions accept this argument, who just believe in a creator or God, who don't believe in Christianity?
Yes. In fact, they do, and also I should add, other non-religious philosophers accept this argument as well. I mean, most religious people believe in God, but there are lots of people who believe in God that aren't religious as well, but who see that yes, there must be a necessary being of some kind. So absolutely, this argument has been used and accepted by many religions, world religions, and many, mostly I would say monotheistic religions. Moses Maimonides argued some version of this argument. The great Muslim philosophers argued. One of the big debates in philosophy is whether or not there must have been a beginning point in time. And of course, Aquinas says, no, philosophy would show that there doesn't necessarily have to be a beginning point in time. It's just a matter of faith that we believe there is. Other philosophers say, no, you can prove philosophically that there was a beginning point in time. But those are still within what I call the family of arguments, known broadly as the cosmological argument. So yes, a resounding yes to your question. Okay. Oh, one more question. Yeah, sorry.
Kind of had to do with that last topic. Couldn't you make the argument philosophically that God being the necessary infinite being in all perfect aspects, if you could say philosophically time is infinite, that means time has no boundaries, thus having no boundaries in nature, that'd be a contradiction to God, so therefore there could not be infinite time because everything other than God has limitations. Or does that philosophically sound?
Well, I mean, yeah, that is the argument that some bring. I mean, the argument that the great Muslim philosopher Al-Ghazali made was that the notion of an infinite past is fundamentally incoherent. That you cannot coherently think of a series of infinite events into the past. And so he said, if you start thinking about that, you'll come up with all kinds of contradictions. So for example, he said, like, imagine, the Earth traveling around the sun, and Saturn traveling around the sun. So for every time Saturn goes around the sun once, Earth goes around 10 times, let's say. So you might say, at this point in time, how many revolutions around the sun has Saturn accumulated versus Earth? Well, if the past truly is infinite, you might say, well, logic would indicate that, well, of course, Earth has accumulated more because it goes around 10 times for every one time Saturn goes around. But if you truly have an infinite past, you might say, well, no, they've both gone around the same number of times because they've both gone around an infinite number of times because they never started. So you have a contradiction. You can reason that the Earth must have more revolutions racked up under its belt, and you can say also that that they have the same, and that's a contradiction, and so there must not be an infinite past. I think I don't think that shows that, but that's the kind of argument that you would get from someone like St. Bonaventure or Al-Ghazali. However, they all believe that there is a starting point. It's just the debate is whether you need to have faith to believe that, or whether philosophy can show it. So, but yeah, great question. All right. Okay, well, I think our questions are. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm not going anywhere immediately, so if you have more questions, I'll
Okay, so yeah, we have the space until 10 p.m., so feel free to hang out, get some more drinks, talk. Like my uncle said, he's not leaving right away, so if you have other questions you want to ask him, feel free. The people sitting in the back on the chairs, if you wouldn't mind, just whenever you're done with them, I mean, it doesn't really matter if you do it right now, but whenever you're done, they go back up here in the front of the room, just so you know. Thanks.
How it was, how it is. You should have brought that up. That would have started. Oh, I know. That's why you should do it. Thank you.